Good afternoon to everyone. As Michelle said, it's fantastic to see so many people here, and we're really delighted to welcome you to the first COVID-19 Trustees conversation, which has been brought to you by both LEAD and JVN. I'd like to start by saying that you and all your families are well, and we also hope that this opportunity and this forum will prove to be useful and popular. And later on at the end of the session, I will share with everyone some of our plans to offer more opportunities for trustees to come together in this way. Before we get underway, I've just got a few housekeeping points, so please bear with me, and if you heard them at the start, I apologise for the repetition. But just to be clear, everyone is already muted, and we do ask that you keep it that way. If you want to ask any questions, please feel free to do so by using the chat box, and you will need to open the chat box yourself because that doesn't happen automatically. Time permitting, we will put forward to Jo as many of those questions as possible at the end of her session, and to the best of her ability, bearing in mind that we will be putting her on the spot, she will answer those or signpost you to some answers. Second point I want to make is that we are recording this session, and both recording and Jo's slideshow will be available on the JVN and LEAD websites, and we'll send you a link to that sometime next week. And then thirdly, we will be taking some rogues gallery photos and screenshots of the session, which seems to now be de rigueur, to use on social media. So if anyone would prefer for their image not to be used, please let Lawrence know, because we can blur those out. And you can either do that by messaging him privately in the chat box or emailing him at some time immediately after this session. Before we get underway, I feel that it's really important to acknowledge that as a community, both collectively and individually, none of us have escaped the challenges, the enormous and continuing loss and the sadness of these circumstances. And at this time, I really want to pay a tribute to the tireless work of my friend and colleague, and sadly past chairman of JVN, David Lazarus, who we so tragically lost to COVID earlier this month. May his memory be a blessing. And being here tonight in this really collaborative way is one of the many testimonies, I think, to his legacy. It now gives me great pleasure to welcome Jo Coleman, because Jo, it's thanks to you that we are actually here tonight. And Jo probably needs little or no formal introduction, as she's well known to the vast majority of us, given her prolific work across the community and the wider charity sector. Jo is also, of course, responsible for annually updating us as trustees at the JCTC event, and I'll talk about that at the end of the session. As an expert in charity law and partner at Womble Bond Dickinson, we are really grateful to you, Jo, to have you with us tonight. And I am very shortly going to hand over to you for your presentation, and then to hear your answer to a number of questions that have been raised in advance by many of the participants in this session. I'm sure that in hearing Jo's answers to those questions and her presentation will give us all some very valuable and important information in these circumstances. And as I said, time permitting, we will also try and answer questions that are raised throughout the evening. So Jo, over to you.
Oh, thanks very much. Somebody unmuted me. Thank you, whoever that was. Otherwise, I'd been talking to myself with my lips moving and no sound. Thanks very much for inviting me. For the next half an hour or so, I've got some slides that I'm going to be running through. These are terrifying times for absolutely everybody. And what I'm just attempting to do for the next half an hour is bring some calm to what feels like a very troubled world environment at the moment. Obviously, as a charity lawyer, I'm focusing on issues for charity trustees in this session, but happy to take questions charity related on anything or any other matter that you may wish to raise. We also asked for a number of questions in advance, which Lawrence dutifully collated in a nice spreadsheet and sent those through to me. I hope that I've picked up most of the answers to those pre-questions in the slides as we go through. But if I haven't, and if there are any further questions that you'd like to ask, then please do use the chat box. I'm going to ask Lawrence to share the slides because I am so technologically brilliant that I couldn't manage to turn my own slides and talk to the camera at the same time when we had a little practice earlier today. So if I can ask Lawrence to share, oh, brilliant, it's working. So here are the slides. So as I said, or as Debbie said, I'm Jo Coleman. I'm a partner in the charities team. I've practiced charity law for about 20 years. And I have never seen anything like the times that charities are currently facing. And I would imagine that the charity sector in 12 months' time is going to look very different from how it looked at the start of 2020. And that's because of this thing, Lawrence, if you want to change the slide. It's been like a big wrecking ball through not only the charity sector, but through the UK and the world. It is changing absolutely everything, the way we do things, the way our healthcare systems operate, the way we function as individuals, as families, as communities. I think we will be returning to a very different world. Someone said the other day, we can't go back to the way things were. We can only move forward. And I think what the future looks like, we will have to wait and see. Lawrence, next slide, please. So I've said so much has changed in the last 6 weeks, but some things stay absolutely the same. And it doesn't matter what decision you're facing, how difficult things are, or how good things are. The 6 key duties of charity trustees will always remain the same. And there's some comfort in knowing that. So I thought it would be good just to sort of start from basics at the beginning. So firstly, to ensure that your charity is carrying out its purposes for the public benefit. And we'll come on to look at why your purposes are important in a COVID world. Secondly, to comply with your charity's governing document, and there's some questions that will be coming up specifically about what do you do when you can't comply with your charity's governing document, and also the law, and in particular the new restrictions, of course, that have been imposed upon us in this lockdown period. Thirdly, to act in your charity's best interests at all times, and also to remember who your charity is there for. These are difficult times for everybody working for charitable organisations, but you don't exist in order to protect your staff or look after their jobs or their careers. Charities are there primarily for your beneficiaries, for those vulnerable people out there that you are designed to work for and on behalf of. Fourthly, to manage your charity's resources responsibly, which is more important than ever, to act with reasonable care and skill, and we'll see what that means in a crisis. And then finally, to ensure that your charity is accountable, that you're still filing your annual returns and your accounts with the Charity Commission, you're letting them know about serious incidents that are happening within your organisation, and generally continuing to tick all the administrative boxes that you need to do. Okay, Lawrence. So your role as trustees, of course, remain legally responsible for your charity, and you need to be satisfied as to the adequacy of your charity's response to COVID-19. You might have an absolutely brilliant executive team, but the buck stops, as you know, with the charity's trustees. And it's really important that in understanding your duties, you take steps to make sure that you can discharge those duties properly at these difficult times. So a few things that you should definitely be doing in the current circumstances: more trustees briefings, telephone meetings, video calls. We know that some charity boards only meet 4 times a year. Well, in this current emergency and in this current crisis, that's almost certainly not enough. There needs to be much more regular communication between trustees and crisis response planning. And the emphasis is always in sort of trying to get things done and getting things done quickly, and maybe appointing 2 trustees to go off and do X, Y, and Z. That's absolutely fine, but all of the trustees need to understand what is being done on behalf of the charity, what the plan is, and how that's going to be implemented. Secondly, you should be considering the impact on your charity's services and your ability to fulfill your charitable purposes. So are there new ways of working and delivery for your beneficiaries that are now possible? So we've seen many organisations very quickly changing the way in which they work and the way in which they engage with their beneficiaries, whether it's providing online counselling services and treatment to, you know, Maccabe's online workouts and dog walking together exercises. So it's been really important to be able to respond quickly and change the way in which your charity is providing its services. Thirdly, of course, it's important to continue to protect and support your beneficiaries. What do they need now, and how can you deliver those services safely? And in particular, how can you ensure that you're protecting those volunteers who might have become involved in your charity to help you deliver in a different way? And in a COVID-related world, you'll be very familiar with the Public Health England guidance on social distancing, keeping safe distances 2 meters apart at all time, but making sure that you can continue to support your beneficiaries through this time in a sensible, cautious and safe way. Fourthly, although it probably should have been first, is financial planning and forecasts. You know, at times like this, times of crisis, cash is king. You need to be modelling your cash flows, I would have said, pretty much on a daily or weekly basis, considering how much cash is coming in, whether you can meet your outgoing liabilities and responsibilities, and looking to see what liabilities you can push back or push off, or ensure that your charity is going to be able to continue to meet your liabilities in the immediate future. As I said, you also need to protect your workforce, your staff and volunteers. Everyone is working incredibly hard at the moment, but they're doing so out of sight. They're at home, working in sometimes difficult situations. You know, I'm quite lucky. I've got 2 teenage children who don't really want to grunt at me, or maybe they'll grunt at me once a day, so it's easy enough for me. But I have colleagues with young children, and the strain of sort of trying to manage homeschooling at the same time as working can be really tough. So protecting your workforce, your staff and volunteers, making sure everyone stays safe and mentally well during this time. The next thing to think about is practical operational changes. So how are you going to approve payments during this period? How will you sign documents? How will you do the sort of practical everyday steps or financial controls that you would manage by having 2 signatories on things? What are the ways in which you can deal and manage with that properly for your charity over the forthcoming period? And then finally, just keep an eye on serious incident reporting to ensure that you are reporting to the Charity Commission where you're required to do so. I mean, I'm absolutely amazed that the Charity Commission has not just simply received 160,000 serious incident reports practically from every charity that's out there, though I suspect there are some grant-making charities who are in a privileged position not to have to worry about it. But nevertheless, most operational charities have suffered major drops in income, in activity, in funding. I filed a serious incident report last week, or 2 weeks ago, in fact, on behalf of a charity that runs a leisure facility that's just had to close its doors. So making sure where there are significant impacts on your charity, that you're filing those serious incidents. As much as anything, you know, the Charity Commission doesn't seem too bothered. It seems to be logging them and simply sending back a thanks for letting us know, well, you know, please keep an eye on things type email. But it's good to ensure that you are demonstrating to the Charity Commission that you've taken these things seriously and you're considering whether or not to report. It shows that you're managing your charity properly and dealing with things appropriately. Thanks, Lawrence. And the point I wanted to make here is really about panic and how panic not being the friend of good and careful decision making. And it's really important that crisis response is still a careful response. Trustees have a duty to act reasonably and with care and skill, and to consider, you know, to take decisions quickly, but to consider them in the round before you act. So what should charity trustees be doing in the current circumstances to help with this? Undoubtedly, there are new risks that are hitting your charities. So, it's not the first thing that you need to do, but at some point over the next few weeks, you need to probably open a new page in your charity's risk register and start to set out the COVID-19 risks that have arisen and the mitigation steps that you're taking. As much as anything else, it's a protection if things don't go well for the future, to show that you've tried to take steps to deal as competently and as practically as you can. Secondly, the year we thought we were coming into in 2020 and the sort of strategy that you'd set yourself for this year has almost certainly been blown out of the water. And it will need to be adapted to meet the current circumstances. I mean, it may even be that your charity would need to suspend your current strategic plan and just simply put in place a 9-month or so plan, if Nicola Sturgeon's to be believed, to enable us to get through the COVID-19 crisis. And to make sure that your charity's objectives are being delivered effectively and sustainably with the resources that you think you're going to have available. And the honest answer to that is, of course, that none of us know. So many charities rely on month-to-month fundraising, and in the current environment where so many people are losing their jobs or being put on furlough and incomes are being reduced, businesses are being hit, we just simply don't know what will happen to charitable giving, although we can make a pretty good guess. You should also be receiving more regular information. As I said, 3 or 4 times a year is not enough. If I were a trustee of one of your charities, I'd want to be receiving a regular update, a sort of short email once a week, more careful cash flows every couple of weeks, just to make sure that your staff are on top of it and you're on top of understanding the likely impact on your charity over the next few months. And then I would say it's really important to document those decisions that you're taking very carefully, particularly where you're making difficult decisions, where you're making unpopular decisions, if you're closing a service, or if you're fundamentally changing the direction of your charity. Then it's really important that those decisions and the reasons for those decisions are set out in a careful board minute. And just because you're having Zoom board meetings doesn't mean that somebody doesn't need to take a careful minute. You might be recording the meetings, that's absolutely fine, but you should still have a written minute of the meeting to set out exactly what took place. And again, it's a protection for your trustees if things don't go right, to show that those meetings were happening. Don't think, just because you're having board meetings weekly, we won't bother to document it. I think it's really important that the journey of your charity through the COVID crisis is properly recorded and reflected. Okay, thanks, Lawrence. So the Charity Commission is still open for business. It is still regulating charities. It's still running its contact centre, and you can call them for advice. They may or may not provide it, I have no idea. Normally I'm 17th in the queue and give up by the time I'm about 4th or 5th in the queue. But anyway, if you've got nothing else to do with a day, you might decide to call the Charity Commission. They're also working differently. They are mostly also working from home and therefore getting used to the new ways of working. And they have been overwhelmed with COVID-related inquiries, permissions, registrations of new charities to sort of set up to deal with the COVID crisis, reporting and other matters relating to COVID. And what they've said very clearly is that if you are reporting a matter around COVID, or you need an urgent permission, or you're seeking, for example, to lift a restriction on a special trust so that you can use those funds immediately for your cash flow purposes, what's really important is in the heading of the email that you send to the Commission, you flag it as a COVID-19 related query, because they're currently triaging all of their emails. So if your matter is not COVID-19, and I've got a couple of matters that are outstanding from the end of last year, and again, I don't anticipate that we'll hear from the Charity Commission on those matters where they're not directly related to this crisis. So they're putting crisis response first. And then they've said some sort of gentle words. They said, we want to assure charities that our approach to regulation during this uncertain period will be as flexible and pragmatic as possible in the public interest, whilst helping trustees to be aware of and think about the wider or longer term impact of their decisions on their charity. So, they will try the theory goes to be as helpful as they can be. Although having said that, I've had to approach the Charity Commission in the last 10 days for a number of urgent applications, and they have been absolutely fantastic in providing a careful and thought through response. Thanks, Lawrence. Yeah, I've just remembered that it's going up on the website, so thought I needed to say something nice. Okay, the Charity Commission has asked and answered a number of questions that they say are common questions that the Charity Commission is being asked. And I put a few of those questions on the next few slides in case they actually are really common questions, and so that you will also be able to share in the answer. The first of their questions was, can your charity help with the coronavirus efforts? I think there was a feeling that a number of charities really wanted to sort of help provide COVID-19 type support, whether it's provision of PPE equipment, or you know, sort of setting up a kind of volunteering scheme to help older people, etc. But it's obviously very important to remember what you were set up for. And if you are an educational charity who are established to provide grants to people attending university, you quite clearly cannot be helping with the COVID-19 crisis. So you need to check your charitable objects and make sure that you are actually able to deliver benefits in the way that you are intending to do. Secondly, you need to check if your beneficiary class is restricted. It's a little bit less common, but in years gone by, some charities used to restrict their class to Jewish people only in this community. So you need to check who you can help and how you're intending to provide that support, whether it's going to all or just to your restricted beneficiary class. And if you don't have the power within your charitable objects to support those charities, then if necessary, you might decide that this need is so immediate and so urgent that it would be appropriate to amend your charitable objectives. And depending on how you're established, there is guidance on the Charity Commission's website about how you would go about amending your objects. In most cases, unless you're a very small charity, you almost certainly would need the Charity Commission's consent to be able to do so, and you'd need to make a very good case as to why that is necessary. Can you use your reserves and your restricted funds? Well, you can certainly use your reserves because they were provided for in order to deal with unexpected events, and this certainly is an unexpected time. But before doing so, you need to ascertain your financial position, determine your priorities, and potentially limit or delay non-essential spending. So if you're in the middle of large building projects or sort of large capital-based projects, you know, do you need to press pause on those before deciding to spend your reserves to finish building a facility that might not actually be needed when we come out the other side of this COVID crisis? So it's important before you make a decision to spend those reserves to know what your charity is going to look like on the other side of this. And also, it goes without saying, you can only spend those reserves once, and once they're gone, then, you know, for example, if your charity wasn't to receive further funding, would you have enough money to pay redundancy costs if you needed to wind up the charity, etc. So it's really important to look very carefully at your reserves before deciding to apply them for cash flow or working capital purposes. You might also want to have a close look at your restricted funds. Sometimes they'll be set out separately in your accounts and they can only be used for particular purposes. And it may be that there are ways of releasing those funds. We did a project for a charity a couple of years ago, and looking at each of the independent pots of restricted funding and special trusts and permanent endowment. In the end, I think we were able to release about £200,000 of funding that the charity had previously thought was restricted. And much of the time with restricted funds, there are misunderstandings about the terms and trusts that apply to those funds. So it's definitely worth, if you're short of money and you have a series of small pots of restricted money, it's definitely worth having a look again at those restricted funds to see whether that's something that you might be able to access. And even if you do have permanently endowed funds, depending on the size of those funds, it might be possible, and I say might, because there are technical steps that you would need to go through, but it might be possible to release the restrictions on those endowments. So definitely, again, worth having a look at that. And then finally, designated funds, which your charity trustees might have decided to designate for a particular purpose, whether it's a sort of sinking fund for dilapidations costs or whatever it might be. If they're only designated, then they can be undesignated, and that might be money that you could well use at the moment. So thanks, Lawrence. What can you do if you're required to hold an AGM? There is talk at the moment of the government passing legislation to deal with company AGMs to make it much easier for companies to be able to hold AGMs virtually. At the moment, if that's not specifically provided for in your Articles of Association, you can't do it. I suppose the first question to ask is whether you have to have an AGM. Some charities hold AGMs because they like to, rather than because their constitution requires them to. And it hasn't been a requirement of private companies to hold an AGM since 2006, unless your Articles of Association specifically provide for you to have one. So it's worth checking your articles. Almost certainly you shouldn't be holding public meetings of people until such time as the social distancing and lockdown measures are released and we're able to meet more than 2 people again. So you should be looking at whether or not to cancel it or to postpone it, or maybe even to amend your Articles of Association so that you can hold it virtually, or maybe pass a written resolution. You need to find a different way of dealing with it. And if you're going to have problems approving your accounts, then you can ask for a filing extension from the Charity Commission on that email address there. Can you hold online or telephone board meetings? The answer to that is always in your constitution. Most modern constitutions will allow you to have a video or telephone meeting. If not, can you amend your constitution to allow it? Speaking completely pragmatically, even if you do not have the power to do so, it is practically speaking the only way in which your charity can do business at the moment, and so you must hold virtual meetings. You know, it would not be a good answer to the question that's asked, you know, well, why didn't you hold meetings? Because we couldn't. It would be much better to be able to say, look, we held these video conferences, technically we didn't have the power, we recorded the meetings, here they are, and we'll ratify our decisions first time we can all sit around a table again, and hopefully that will be as soon as possible. So you definitely, of course, you need to follow your constitution, but even more important is that you're having the necessary meetings that you need to. And if you can change your constitution to make it compliant, then I would do so. Thanks, Lawrence. Do we need to report COVID-19 as a serious incident? Not necessarily. You should assess the impact on your charity against the guidelines. I mean, if your primary source of funding is to send 20 runners into the London Marathon this Sunday, then you probably have a serious incident on your hands if you've lost the funding from their sponsorship. And you should be reporting using the Charity Commission's online form if you think that you've experienced a serious incident. How do you protect your people, staff, volunteers and beneficiaries? It's really important to stay up to date with government guidance and protocols on working, and they've issued different guidances for working in schools, working in social care settings, in hospitals, etc., etc. So you need to find the right guidance that's relevant to your particular organisation and make sure that you follow it, and that the trustees have considered how you're going to deliver on that. And then finally, there's some additional guidance, the Charity Commission safeguarding guidance, and your own safeguarding protocols, which you may actually need to update and review. I mean, if you are, for example, providing a counselling service and you would normally do that face-to-face, well, very different rules apply when you're providing that type of service online. And it may be that you need to provide different or better change safeguarding protocols. Okay. Lawrence, sorry. Thanks. And then another common question was, can we work with a company or business to raise funds? So that's why I had a sneaking suspicion that maybe they weren't common questions. But anyway, the usual rules apply. you should be undertaking due diligence on your proposed partner, making sure that they're a suitable person for you to be entering into a partnership with. You need to ensure that the relationship's in your best interests. You know, they say there's no such thing as a free lunch, and it generally applies with charities and philanthropic endeavour as well. So, you know, just as you know what you're getting out of it, what is your partner going to be getting out of it? And then you need to identify any risks, including potentially to your reputation, and mitigations. And when charities are in trouble for money, you know, the temptation is not to ask where it's coming from, or maybe not to ask as many questions as you would in normal times. You know, I've said it at the beginning and I'll say it again, normal rules continue to apply. You need to ask the same questions, do the same diligence as you would at any other time. And then finally on this page, where, for example, you know, a local shop says, you know, for every pound, you know, for every product sold, £1 will go to the local food bank. That is a commercial participation arrangement. It's a special type of fundraising arrangement which needs a particular type of legal agreement. And if you don't have a commercial participation or professional fundraising agreement in place, then you are breaking the law. So it's just important with that type of arrangement that you get the legals right. Thanks, Lawrence. So there was an alert issued at the end of last week by the Charity Commission. I'm sure you've seen this on the news because it was widely reported in the last few days, but unfortunately, coronavirus scams are on the increase. We're all spending a lot more time online, and the number of online scams apparently are growing at an exponential rate. So procurement fraud, fake sellers of PPE, mandate fraud, so you know, those emails that come through to your accounts team telling them to change the supplier payment details, and you can imagine that working from home, it's harder to double check or follow the standard procedures in checking before you make any changes. But it's really important that all your accounting staff stay live to those sorts of fraud, even when they're, you know, sitting in their bedroom and don't feel particularly threatened at home. Apparently, again, an increase in scam emails and phishing attacks, unsolicited offers of goods, services, or financial support, where people sort of ask for your bank details, and then next time you look, everything's gone. You need obviously to protect your devices and laptops with up-to-date software to make sure that there's no fraud or attack or cybercrime attack able to attack your systems, and then to report to Action Fraud and to the Charity Commission promptly. And there's some really good guidance on protecting your charity from cybercrime, which at the moment is more relevant than ever. Thank you, Lawrence. So the fundraising regulator has also issued some guidance on how charities ought to be fundraising at the current time. They said the most important thing is to stay up to date with the latest government guidance, which may affect fundraising activities and events. So whether you can hold a marathon or a fundraising dinner, that sort of thing. They say that you should and can continue to fundraise, but you should do so in a respectful way at this time, which follows the code of fundraising practice and has regard to people's particular vulnerabilities at this time. They've also issued a warning for charities to stop all person-to-person fundraising while we're in this phase of lockdown. So not to go door to door, obviously not to be, sort of chuggers on the street standing outside Sainsbury's door stopping people for donations. That has been stopped at the moment. And under the current restrictions, place-based events at a venue are not allowed because we can't have gatherings of more than 2. They've also said, next slide please, that in relation to events that you've had to cancel, it's important obviously to stay in touch with all of your stakeholders that were involved to let them know. Consider whether donations that have already been made need to be refunded. And again, they'll all need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So some people, when they're giving to marathon-related sponsorship, will do it conditional upon you running the marathon, and others will just make you the donation anyway. And it just depends on how the gift or the fundraising appeal page has been set up. So you need to look at each particular case. And where you're considering making refunds, there are particular difficulties and issues for charities making refunds to donors. So you must consider the Charity Commission's guidance and make sure that you've understood that. And then to be clear about whether you're postponing or cancelling the event. And of course, to review your insurance policies. There's been a lot of hoo-ha about insurance and insurers' willingness to pay out under event cancellation insurance. The devil will be in the detail, and you will need to review very carefully the terms and conditions of your insurance policies, and then to have a very robust conversation with your insurance broker and never give up. That's the key. Finally, for tickets for cancelled events, HMRC has announced a concession. So where you have individuals who have bought a ticket for a charity event and the events had to be cancelled, the ticket price, if they have said they don't want a refund, can now be gift aided. So whereas you might not have been able to receive gift aid on the original ticket because they were buying effectively entry to an event, you may now be able to get gift aid on the price, provided obviously the donors agree that it doesn't need to be refunded. And there's guidance on the HMRC website there about how you process those transition to gift aids. Thanks, Lawrence. Okay, so there's not much of the government relief schemes that will be open to charities, and the charity sector has been running its own campaign for the last 6 weeks called #EverydayCounts, trying to get government to listen, and we'll come on to see in a few slides time quite what they've done. But there is a really good government support finder tool at that link where you enter some key basic details about your organisation, and it will bring up the whole list of government support that will be available to your organisation, including whether you'd be able to defer VAT, business rates relief. There are small grants available to certain types of charitable organisations from the local authorities for charities of a smaller size. It is, I can't stress this enough, even if you don't think there is anything for your charity, it is worth running the basic essentials through that finder tool just to make sure. But the one that most charities have been making use of over the course of the last few weeks is the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. That word furloughing that we had never heard of 4 weeks ago and are now all too familiar with. So the British Heart Foundation are reported to have made 80% of their staff put them on furlough. Girl Guidings lost 50% to furlough. The National Trust 80% to furlough. Oxfam's 2/3 of its staff to furlough. I mean, there are many large charitable organisations who have found themselves in a position where they feel they have no choice but to avail themselves of the furloughing scheme. So it's open to all UK employers who have a PAYE scheme in place on the 19th of March. It enables employers to furlough staff in order to avoid making them redundant where you have no work for those staff. And then you can apply for a grant of up to 80% of the wage costs, up to a cap of £2,500 per employee. And as employers, you can choose to top up salaries, but you don't need to. The scheme applies from the 1st of March. Originally, it was till the end of May. It's now been extended to the 30th of June, and the portal opened this Monday. And I haven't heard much fuss at all. So I'm assuming that the portal is working fine and people are able to make their claims. Furlough has to be for a minimum of 3 weeks, but staff can then be called back. And we're told that it's perfectly possible to rotate staff on furlough. So every 3 weeks, someone comes in, goes out, etc., if that's what you wanted to do. Lawrence, new slide, please. But whilst, and this is really critical, whilst furloughed, an employee must not work, volunteer, or generate any income for or on behalf of their employer. They can undertake training and they can volunteer elsewhere for other charitable organisations as long as they're not generating revenue for your charity. An employee will need to consent to being furloughed, and this has to be confirmed in writing to them. But I'm not aware of many staff faced with being asked to furlough who have said no, because the alternative almost certainly would be redundancy. And you must be careful not to discriminate in how you make your furlough decisions, whether that's in respect of any of the regular protected characteristics. And this is another quirk of the furlough scheme for charities. Organisations that receive public funding, so that's from government or Arts Council, other lottery type bodies, the academies, for salary costs are expected to use that funding. And so you can't furlough those staff. The idea is that where government essentially is already paying for those staff, you're not then entitled to put them on furlough and claim a grant for their salary. But the position is much more complicated for those organisations that have mixed funding, so that have a range of government grants and other income sources. And so you're advised to take advice. Thanks, Lawrence. Should you furlough your staff? This is one of the questions I was asked in advance. It sort of sounded like it was put as a moral question, which I think is one of the reasons why I just read out those statistics about other large national charities. Because if you have no work for your staff and you don't have the funds to pay them, then you may very well have little choice. Another wrinkle with holidays is where employees are furloughed and decide to take holiday during a period of furlough, they have to be paid under the Working Time Directive 100% of their salary for those holiday days, even though they're being taken during a furlough period. So it's been suggested that it might be a way of staff potentially boosting their pay during a furlough period by agreeing to sort of take some holiday during that time. So staff, as I said before, can volunteer for other organisations, but you shouldn't be backfilling furloughed roles with volunteers. The idea is if you have no work for the staff, then you put them on furlough rather than getting a bunch of volunteers to help do employees' work who have been furloughed. The scheme is being changed on a reasonably regular basis, so you need to keep up to date with key changes and clarifications. And remember to stay in touch with furloughed staff. These are really difficult decisions that we're having to take in relation to our staff, and sometimes the tendency can be to sort of out of sight, out of mind. We can't bear the pain that we've brought upon people, but it's really, really important with furloughed staff that as an organisation that you keep in touch and then record all decisions carefully. Thanks, Lawrence. So what, after their hashtag every day counts campaign, the charity sector managed to get a £750 million support package unveiled for charities, which is a drop in the ocean compared to the billions and billions that's been unveiled for business. But nevertheless, it was unveiled by the Chancellor on the 8th of April for UK related charity work only, and it is mostly targeted at those charities that are providing vital services in this COVID time. So 360 million will be allocated directly by government departments to those who provide vital services, including a big chunk of that, which is 200 million to the hospices. Another big slug, I think, to St John's Ambulance for the work that they are doing supporting our ambulance service, to domestic abuse charities, vulnerable children's charities, and also to citizens advice. I understand that the government departments are currently making their allocations between those various charities, and they will decide who gets what. The next £370 million is to go to the National Lottery Community Fund, although I saw that Oliver Dowden, Secretary of State for DCMS, said yesterday at the Select Committee that he might not give them £370 million in one go. He might drip feed it to make sure that the grant schemes are getting through properly. But the idea there is that there'll be small grants to small and medium-sized organisations, possibly up to £1 million, administered by the NLCF, and there'll be grants of up to £100,000. And then finally, of that 750 million, there is 20 million matched funding for the Big Night In, which is tonight, which is the comic relief and children in need night of fun. If David Walliams and it is your thing, then I think there's a new Little Britain sketch, but it's very difficult doing things over Zoom, I think, so quite how they'll make that funny. I should imagine I need to watch and find out. Anyway, so that's matched funding for Big Night In. Lawrence, thanks. There are other funding opportunities for charities. NCVO has got a really good website which they update daily, and they are collecting updates and coronavirus type emergency relief funding from a lot of the big grant makers, and you can find details of those schemes on that link there. There are also a number of mass participation events that have been launched, which charities can join in with. So the 2.6 challenge is this Sunday, and it's designed to replace the London Marathon on the 26th of April. And people are being encouraged for the charity that they wish to support to do something with a 2 or a 6 in. So I think somebody on the radio this morning was doing 26 keepy uppies or something, I don't know. Anyway, and then finally, there's really good fundraising advice on the Institute of Fundraising's website, fundraising remotely during this time. It will not be everybody who manages to find a Captain Tom Moore who just manages to capture the imagination of the nation, and by walking his 100 lengths of his garden for his 100th birthday raises, was it about £28 million now? So we will be very lucky if we manage to sort of capture the public imagination in that way, but there are ways and means. Thanks, Lawrence. Just very quickly, you have a continuing duty to protect and promote the health of your staff. That doesn't change just because they're working from home. And there was a really good website that was launched yesterday called Our Front Line, which is on the mental health at work .org.uk, which has been launched by Samaritans, Mind and Hospice UK. And it's got lots of resources on there for frontline workers. So it's specifically targeted at NHS workers and frontline care workers. But when I had a look at some of the resources on there, they're brilliant, kind of sort of dealing with anxiety, dealing with stress, stressful situations, dealing with uncertainty, that would apply to anyone. So I would sort of offer that to you. Okay, next. Thank you. Contracts, grants and insurance. Really the only thing I want to say here is that there may be opportunities for you to defer payments on contracts that you've entered into, on rent that you owe, on grants that might need to be repaid in certain circumstances, and there may be insurance that you can call upon. What's really important is that somebody on behalf of your charity does a very careful review, checks the terms, looks at the force majeure clauses, and works out what your options are. Where you're receiving grant funding from some of the large funders, with very detailed KPIs, I would say talk to your commissioners and funders. They are listening. And I put some details here of the London Funders, which is a consortium of grant making organisations in London. And they put out a statement on behalf of those grant making organisations, which pledged that they would adapt their activities in terms of outputs and outcomes, discuss dates, financial flexibility, and would keep listening. So if you have got funders who are being unreasonable with you, I would suggest you point them at the London Funders statement and suggest that they play the game a little bit more helpfully. Thanks, Lawrence. I wasn't going to talk about what happens if the worst happens. But then earlier today, the Charity Commission issued new guidance on managing financial difficulties in your charity. And so I kind of felt obliged to mention it. It's a good piece of guidance. It flags up a number of their other existing guidances, including CC12, which is about managing in difficult times and potentially where there's insolvency. And the Charity Commission in that note have set out all of the considerations that your charity might need to take into account. So the need to reduce costs, the need to deal immediately with your current crop of beneficiaries, as opposed to ensuring that your charity can survive for the future. Or just a simple decision like, whether to sell investments in the current market conditions, where, investments are already down 30 or 40% against the need for immediate cash. And I think it's a good piece of guidance which may be of help to you. And then they also went on in that guidance, Lawrence, to talk about the end, the final curtain. Want to just turn the slide for me? Deciding to close your charity. So, if there really are no options, and, we all like to be hopeful, but we also need to be realistic. And where it gets to the point where you really cannot continue to operate, then you need to take urgent action to make sure that you'd be able to close down safely and solvently. And obviously, depending on how you're established, if you're a charitable company, then that might mean a company insolvency type situation. If you're an unincorporated charity, and you'll have heard me say this before, then there is no separate legal personality for your charity. And if you find yourself in a situation where you can't meet your debts, those debts might fall personally on the trustees themselves. So it's really important that you are on top of the finances of your charity, and that you understand going forward what your options are and the points at which you're going to need to make certain decisions so that you're able to act while you still have time. Thanks, Lawrence. Some concluding thoughts then. Situation remains challenging. It's likely to remain uncertain for some considerable time to come. You know, I think many of us hoped that this would be a sort of 6-week or 12-week blip, sort of nice time at home in the garden. It will not be that. If Nicola Sturgeon is the line that will be followed by the English government as well, we will be stuck in some sort of isolation for a considerable period of time. And so trustees need to act reasonably, make informed decisions, document them carefully, keep up to date with government and sector guidance, seek professional advice if necessary. And I'd say that if you're facing a potential insolvency type situation, make sure you take that advice early, because it's the best protection that you can offer to your directors. To always act in good faith, and finally, as I'm sure you're aware, to act always and at all times in the best interests of your charity and its beneficiaries. Thanks, Lawrence. If you just go, I will take some questions in a minute, but if you just go forward one more slide. At the end of this presentation, I've just put a couple of additional resources, other websites. Our firm is running a COVID-19 hub, as I'm sure many are, but there's a list of resources there that may be helpful to you. Okay.
Jo, thank you very, very much indeed. That was really comprehensive, albeit sobering. And just to reiterate, for those who perhaps weren't around at the very start, we will share that presentation. It'll go on the JVN and Lead website, and we will send a link through to it. And I know that Michelle has very kindly kept up with a lot of the links that Jo has given us on her website in the chat box. So people might want to take them down now, but there will be an opportunity. We've got a couple of questions from the floor, so to speak. So are you happy for me to give them to you? The first question, and you did deal with this to some extent when you talked about changing charitable objects, but the question is it okay to change your constitution to allow you to do things that the constitution doesn't allow? And the specific examples there are to extend terms of office periods or roles for trustees.
Yes, definitely. So you have to comply with your constitution, but provided you amend your constitution in the way in which your constitution requires you to, then you can change the rules. So you know, normally your constitution will have a clause on amending the constitution, and provided you follow very carefully what it sets out in that clause, then you can amend it however you want. Generally with administrative provisions like extending the terms of office of trustees or changing the size of the board, there's absolutely no problem with doing that at all. There are a number of key regulated amendments which you generally have to get the Commission's consent for. So if you're changing your objects, if you're changing what happens on dissolution, or if you're changing the benefits that can be provided to trustees, those are the three circumstances in which I would expect you normally to have to go to the Charity Commission. There are also a number of other charities where if you are changing, where you're a membership charity and you're changing the rights of your members, sometimes you can also have to go off to the Charity Commission for consent. But you need to look at your constitution, find the amendments clause and follow it.
Thank you. Couple more questions, one from the floor, and then I'm going to admit that one's from me, but can I just remind everyone, because we've got a little more time, if you have any questions, just post them in the chat box now. But the second question is about furlough, Jo, and it's whether a furloughed member of staff can undertake emergency help to vulnerable individuals. I'm assuming that means within the charity from which they've been furloughed.
Yeah, so the furloughed staff members cannot provide any assistance at all to the charity. So any operation that is run or overseen or managed by the charity cannot receive assistance of the furloughed member of staff, and they cannot volunteer for the charity from which they have been furloughed.
Thank you. And then can I throw another one at you?
Yeah, of course.
It's just really an extension of what you were talking about in terms of employers having to pay 100% for scheduled holidays. If employers are encouraging their furloughed employees to take holiday during a furlough period, would that constitute scheduled or unscheduled?
I think that, well, I would need to double check, but I think that a furloughed member of staff, even once they're furloughed, can then choose to take a holiday during that time. So I don't think it has to be pre-booked, but it does bring me neatly onto a point that I meant to mention and completely forgot to, which is holidays generally, which is that a lot of employers have started to be very worried about staff who are because they can't go anywhere and they can't take holidays, are simply not taking holiday days at this time. And they're worried that, when we do get back to the new normal, say, for example, in September, staff may well have 4 or 5 weeks holiday left to take between September and Christmas. And different firms are dealing with it differently, but I know that our firm has just introduced a policy yesterday. I say policy, but they have put it as a gentle request, for which read you must, to say that staff will need to take 8/12 of their holiday by the end of August. And I think that charities will need to have regard to what they're going to do about staff and holidays, in order not to face a position where everybody wants to get the motor running back in September if we ever find ourselves back in offices again, and everyone's disappeared on holiday. So just another thing to think about.
Okay, a couple more questions coming through. This one is, what if you can't follow the procedures set out in your constitution to make amendments to it, i.e. that your constitution says you can only do this at a physical general meeting?
So it depends how you're set up. Under the Companies Act, you generally can do anything that you're supposed to do in general meeting by written resolution. So depending on how many members you have, it may be possible to pass a written resolution, have it circulated around your members and change it in that way, so as to avoid having to have a general meeting. If you're not a company and your constitution says it has to be at a physical general meeting, then I wouldn't have thought even this morning that you could do this, but I've heard other examples today of people writing to the Charity Commission, asking for the Charity Commission to make an order to allow it to happen. It normally wouldn't be the way that the Commission works, but they seem to have got some assistance from the Charity Commission in that way. But if you're a charitable company, there's almost certainly a way around it by using the written resolution procedure.
Thank you. And I think this might be the last question, Jo, and it pertains to grant making charities. And the question is, are grant making charities responsible for their beneficiary charities complying with COVID-19 requirements? And this could also be across several countries.
It's a difficult question. I suppose the answer will be it depends. I mean, 2 years ago, we didn't even think grant-making charities were responsible for ensuring that their beneficiary charities complied with safeguarding rules and regulations. And then all of a sudden, about 18 months ago, we got that note from the Charity Commission, which said, no, all grant makers must make sure that their beneficiary charities are complying with safeguarding. So I would imagine that the Commission would take a kind of similar approach in relation to COVID-19. I hope that the charities with whom you partner and to whom you provide funding would be following those guidance, that guidance anyway. And I suppose if it comes to your attention that they're not, then you as an organisation need to take stock of what it is you can do. And depending on the terms of your grant making agreement, the answer might be not very much, except for never make them a grant again. It may simply be that the money's gone and there's not much you can do except for writing a dear sirs letter to them. But if you've got a well-drafted grant agreement and they've done something which potentially could damage their beneficiaries or put their volunteers or their staff at risk, then it may be that you can claw back the grant, and you may wish to seek to do so, or at least threaten to do so, in order to ensure that they're acting safely and properly in relation to their own operations.
Thank you. And I have got one more. The question is, can you ask your staff, it goes back to holidays, can you ask your staff to take 50% of their holiday by the end of June rather than 8/12 by the end of August? I know who this comes from, who's very mathematical.
So I think you can, well, as I said, I don't think we changed our policy on holiday. I think we've set out very clear guidance on what the firm would like. And I think there's absolutely no problem at all in setting your own parameters in that regard. Apart from anything else, it's really quite wearing working from home constantly. And although staff might feel like it's a waste of holiday, actually just having some space to do something else and to switch off from work is going to be important as we go further into this working from home reality.
I agree with that, absolutely. Looking at the chat, there are no more questions from the audience. So I know that we're slightly ahead of schedule, but I want to round up, Jo, by saying thank you to you again. This has been so illuminating and so informative. And I think by virtue of the fact that your presentation was so comprehensive, we haven't been flooded with questions, but thank you to those who have raised questions, because I think they've really added. I've also got some very live information from my very responsive, supportive lead team to say that what they will do, given that you've given so many useful links that people will probably want to access as we exit the meeting, we'll follow this up with we'll just do a PDF of the presentation immediately tonight, rather than for it to go up on the website, which we'll do anyway, but people will have a PDF of the presentation so they can have a look at those links immediately. It would be really good to have feedback from everyone who's been with us this evening. So we will be following up with an evaluation, which will come to you by way of email. Obviously, to hear from you how the session has been from your perspective, but also to understand from you whether you want more sessions on different topics of this type. And I would say that we are also running, as we had planned to do, but obviously virtually, the Trustees networking event. So you will be getting a reminder of that and the date, which is imminent. And we also, and here's the irony, Jo is part of the planning group for our annual Jewish Community Trustees Conference. The theme of that conference, which we started to plan 9 months ago, was through the digital lens. So we certainly, and I will give credit to Lawrence Rosenthal here, had some foresight as to what may be coming down the line. We will still run that event. It will be obviously virtual, but probably never more important and relevant a time to have some conversations about how we are adapting and responding digitally in this particular sector. So information and the forthcoming dates will be sent to everyone. I will sign off now by thanking you again, Jo, and also extending my thanks very much to Lawrence for leading on this, and to Michelle and to Nikki at JVN. It's been great teamwork, and I thank everyone for their contribution and for being with us this evening. I wish you all and your families only safe, healthy and easier times.